Are you sure you really know yourself? Like, you really understand who you are and why you view the world and other people the way you do? Most people think they do, and many people put a lot of effort into it. But what if I told you that you've likely been misinterpreting who you really are because you've been examining yourself with blinders on? That's what we're going to explore in today's episode. And it's so important because it's the key to closing the gap between our behavior and our intentions. And doing that is what unlocks the power to transform your relationship with yourself, everyone around you, and your relationship with God. It's that powerful. Hello, and welcome to Powered by Purpose. I'm Melody Lacey, and I help people clear the distorted perceptions that keep us from being able to see ourselves and others the way Jesus does. Because the struggle is real, you guys. Most of us are struggling to some degree to live and relate to others the way he calls us to. And that tension is what's keeping us emotionally reactive and disconnected from how he's called us to live. So, we're going to take a God and others approach to self discovery and personal growth to unpack the real root cause behind the friction of your life and your relationships. We'll do this by demystifying how your beliefs shape your perception of reality by looking at the evidence your life is already revealing so you can clearly see what's actually driving your behavior. And we'll look at how to recalibrate your thinking with God's truth so that you can start seeing things more clearly. Because when you see yourself more clearly, you'll be able to see others more clearly too. And then everything else falls into place. So, whether you're building a business, leading a family, coaching a team, or simply trying to live your life more faithfully, this is how we close the gap between your behavior and your intentions so you can truly honor God and fulfill his unique calling for your life. Because the reality is, renewed minds require more than just good intentions. So, let's get into it. I think one of the biggest lies people believe is that self awareness simply means thinking about yourself a lot. But I've come to learn that truthful self awareness requires an accurate interpretation of information. And most of us have never actually been taught how to interpret ourselves clearly. That's the journey I've been on for years, and it's why I do the work I do now. And it all started back in 2002 with my first therapy session. I'll never forget it. I went into that session with a list of events that had taken place in the prior 2 years. Little things like my father unexpectedly dying at only 51, graduating from college and moving away from my then grieving mother and my sister to start a new job that I ended up hating and then changing to a new position. But there were good things too, like meeting my husband and getting married. I also started my MBA while working full time. So, those are the things I had dealt with, at least I thought I had, because time kept going on. And I thought, hey, I'm moving on too, because I'm moving along with time. But I brought them anyway, because I figured they were still helpful context for this discussion with this new person. Because the thing was, I was tormented by the disconnect I was feeling between what I thought I had dealt with and that little recent panic attack that had woken me up in the middle of the night. So clearly something was going on, which is why I made the appointment. I explained to her that my main complaint, which is something I had had for a long time, was that I just couldn't reconcile why I could know something was true. I could truly believe it, explain it to others intellectually, but still not feel like I'm actually experiencing it or able to live it out. This was plaguing me, and it had been for years. And at the time, I thought there was something wrong with me. I became obsessed with working on myself and figuring out how to have a job and not hate my life. Because for a long time, those two things seemed to go hand in hand. And like most people, my intentions were generally good. I wanted to do all the things, right? Like love people well, communicate clearly, show up consistently, and be emotionally steady, and be a faithful steward in all I had been given. I was actively seeking God and trying to trust Him that everything was happening for a reason. And I was asking Him to guide my steps. I felt like I was doing all the things. I was looking inward for how I could personally grow and improve when I was faced with all the frustrations at work, and there were a lot of them. But in the midst of my struggle, my behavior wasn't representing my intentions, which was the exact disconnect I was trying to address. The reality was, my stress behavior was what people saw in me most days, and I definitely wasn't my best self, and that was playing out in various forms, like being emotionally reactive, which actually goes against my normal nature of being calm and composed, but that's when I'm not stressed. It also played out in feeling constantly exhausted from the daily friction inside my head, which of course created tension in some of my relationships, especially at work, which then led to feeling insecure about myself and the path that I was on and my ability to keep going. And I just couldn't seem to break those patterns. So finally, in 2010, now with 8 years of therapy behind me that didn't really get me anywhere, I hit a breaking point and I took a 12-week hiatus from work, which became the first pivotal point in my entire life. And looking back now, I can see I was driving myself absolutely crazy, trying to force myself to function inside environments and expectations that fundamentally conflicted with how I'm intrinsically wired. That's what was causing the chronic stress behavior, the self condemnation, and emotional exhaustion, which of course had those relational consequences. And they resulted in emotional volatility because I was ashamed of myself and confused as to why I couldn't just do better and live congruently with my intentions. Because what I've come to realize is that I was actually misinterpreting myself and the world around me the whole time. I didn't have the tools then to diagnose the fact that I was examining and evaluating myself against a bunch of inherited standards that I couldn't live up to, while also unconsciously living according to a different set of personal priorities. That was the root of the conflict. And it all makes sense now. The inherited standards are what drove me into work environments that weren't a good fit for me. And I was trying to perform at my best in spite of the frustration I felt. And I was using those inherited standards as false evaluation criteria for my performance. And that whole cycle was skewing my perception of the situation and everyone else involved in it. So here's what I've learned since then. And I hope this can help you avoid, or maybe at least stop, this cycle in your own life. Because you see, misinterpretation happens because of two primary factors. The first one is perception bias. This is the lens we use to interpret our version of reality. And it's formed through what we've been taught from our family, our culture, religion, and what we've internalized from the emotional experiences we've had and the social conditioning that came with them. We pair that with our fears and insecurities and the aspirations we have in life. And then we pair those with the second factor, which is the fact that any given moment, we're evaluating things with incomplete or inaccurate information. And that's because we rarely possess the full context of any situation. So, how can we expect to have an objective understanding or accurate self awareness, let alone an accurate view of others? So, our brain fills the gaps. And what does it fill those gaps with? Perception bias, which is right where we started. So, round and round we go. It becomes an endless cycle when we don't have the tools to diagnose and address it properly. And this is where the know yourself culture fails, because most people are trying to discover themselves and improve and heal themselves and optimize themselves. But if they're not first correcting the distorted lens through which they're evaluating themselves, they just get lost in that cycle. And what this means is you go deeper inward and you have more distortion you reinforce along the way. And that's what explains the chronic self condemnation, the comparison with others, the emotional instability and relational conflict, the burnout and misaligned careers, your identity fragmentation and spiritual frustration, and years spent forcing ourselves into misaligned environments. And then you're fooled into thinking that you're getting closer to self awareness. but it's been limited to your self directed introspection, your identity exploration, and emotional processing. And then we throw in some personality typing just for fun. When in reality, truthful self awareness requires a much more accurate interpretation. Because our interpretation of everything, ourselves included, is a direct result of our perception, which is highly individualistic and formed by all those inherited standards, which I just mentioned, right? From our faith, our family, and our friends, the social conditioning, which comes from our schools and our community. And then there's the aspirational identities that are rooted in performance culture and those personality labels, basically everything that exists outside ourselves. And to be clear, I'm not saying all inherited standards are negative per se. In fact, God calls us to inherit his standards because he knows that we can't love him and others without his help, which is precisely why we're called to be transformed through the renewing of our minds, which, by the way, is not just behavior modification and positive thinking or religious performance. It is the truthful correction of the distorted perceptions. So, renewing the mind means correcting the lens because it's the interpretation and application of those external standards where we get caught up and confused relative to any of the disconnects with our own personal priorities, which many people aren't even consciously in tune with. Because you see, there's a sweet spot of exploring who you are based on the evidence in your life, which is what reveals your true priorities, and then comparing that with the inherited standards you've been judging yourself and everyone else against. And then evaluating that information against your growth opportunities relative to God's calling for your life, which incidentally you start to discover through this process. Because this process is different, because it takes an objective approach using the data in your life versus just your feelings, which then gives you a solid foundation to build off of. That is where other approaches fall short. And it's why I've created an adaptation of the approaches that helped me. And it's why I'm here talking to you about it today. Because it is important to understand ourselves. Because whether we know it or not, we project ourselves onto every relationship in our life, which is why it's so hard to love others as ourselves. So if we're beating ourselves up, it just makes sense that we're doing that to others as well, which is why it's the easiest area to see the outward consequences of misinterpretation, our relationships. Because if you misinterpret yourself, you will also misinterpret other people. You misinterpret conflict and criticism. You perceive things as rejection where it might not be. You misinterpret responsibility and authority, and even God. Because when you misinterpret yourself, you inevitably project that insecurity onto others and judge them unfairly while you're actually seeking validation. But you're reacting emotionally because you're personalizing situations with constant comparison, because you're defending your identity, which means you're relating to others from distortion instead of truth. I mean, I suppose it's your truth, but it's a distorted truth. And that's why relationships become the visible evidence of skewed perceptions. But don't worry, I'm not going to leave you hanging with these truth bombs and no way to address them. That wouldn't be cool. Because you deserve more than the standard self improvement approach that simply asks you to explore who you want to become. My framework goes deeper by guiding you through a process that uncovers the evidence of what your life is already revealing about what's actually governing your thoughts and behavior. It looks at your lived evidence, which brings you to truthful self awareness, while identifying your intrinsic drivers, which are key input to the next step of perception recalibration, which is where the renewal of the mind takes place. And this is all based on proven methodologies that I've combined and paired with God's truth that brought me more relief and clarity than I ever found through other methods. And it's why I'm so passionate about bringing them to you. And you can start your journey for free. The link is below, so check it out and start exploring yourself more objectively and honestly so you can clearly see what priorities are governing your behavior and comparing them with the standards you inherited, which are influencing your intentions. Because once you realize you may have been misinterpreting yourself, you'll start noticing something else too. The way you see other people has been being filtered through those same distortions. So, this is why self awareness is the first step towards being able to fulfill the second greatest commandment to love others as yourself. And that's what we'll unpack next week. So, until then, take care and check out the free tool below.